My name is Elena. I'm 42 years old, and my life has been a quiet routine for the past decade. Mornings, work, grocery store, home, repeat. I once dreamed of love, of something powerful and consuming. But those dreams faded into the monotony of everyday life. That Tuesday, everything started just like any other day. I was in the produce section, carefully choosing the best apples, when I noticed him. A young man no older than 20, leaning in to grab the same apple one had just touched. His dark hair fell carelessly over his forehead, and his eyes, bright and alive like summer skies after rain, met mine. Did I hold his gaze too long? Was this politeness, or was it something more? "Excuse me," he said, leaning in slightly closer. I felt our fingers barely brush. "Why did I hold that gaze?" "Please take it," I said, forcing a smile. "Are you sure?" His lips curled into a playful grin. "It seems like the best one." I laughed, genuinely, and for the first time in a while. When was the last time I laughed like that? Did he notice? "I'll survive," I replied, and our gazes met again. We exchanged a few more words about apples, the weather, the line at the register. Nothing significant, but I couldn't help but notice how easy it was to talk to him. Could such a brief encounter mean something more? Or am I just reading into something that isn't there? As I walked home, I felt something strange. What was it? A light curiosity, or was it a spark I was afraid to name? Could I see him again if I wanted to? That evening, while preparing dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about him. What had drawn me to him? His smile, his quiet confidence, or maybe how he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about him more often than I cared to admit. I hadn't expected such a fleeting encounter to stick with me, yet here I was, replaying that brief moment in my mind. Every time I went to the grocery store, I kept an eye out for him, though I didn't expect to see him again. But then one afternoon it happened. He was there again, standing near the same apples, a small smile playing on his lips when he saw me. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello again," he said, almost teasingly. I smiled back, the familiar warmth settling in my chest. "Back for the best apple." "Maybe," he shrugged, "but I think I'm here for the company this time." His words made me laugh, and I found myself drawn to the ease of our conversation. We talked about everything and nothing. About his university studies, the books we liked, the quiet streets of a city. The more we spoke, the more I realized how much I enjoyed his presence. There was a youthful energy about him, a freshness that made me feel lighter, more alive. I could feel myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years. Was this just the novelty of youth? Was I merely enjoying the excitement of talking to someone with a different perspective? Or was it something deeper? He began to visit the store more frequently, and each time, we exchanged smiles and light conversation. It felt like a natural progression. But there was something unspoken between us. A tension, perhaps, but one that neither of us acknowledged directly. Still, it was there, lingering in the air. One afternoon, after we had spent some time talking near the coffee aisle, he asked, "Would you like to grab a coffee sometime? I mean, outside of here." His offer took me by surprise. Was he serious? Or was it just an innocent suggestion? I hesitated, uncertain. Should I accept? Would it be a mistake? I didn't want to overthink it, but I couldn't help myself. The age difference between us was still at the back of my mind. "Sure," I said, surprising myself. "I'd like that." His smile grew, and I could sense a change in the air between us, something more real than before. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I thought about our upcoming coffee. Was this the beginning of something? Or was it just another small moment in my otherwise predictable life? Could this really go anywhere? Or was I setting myself up for disappointment? The coffee was set for the following Saturday, but even in the days leading up to it, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I thought about our planned meeting, my heart fluttered unexpectedly. I tried to dismiss it as nerves. After all, it was just coffee, just another casual meeting between two people who barely knew each other. But deep down, I knew it was more. The day arrived, and I spent far too much time choosing what to wear. I wanted to look good, but not like I was trying too hard. I wanted to seem confident, relaxed, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how nervous I was. What was I even expecting from this? When I saw him at the cafe, standing in line for our drinks, I felt my heart race. He looked just as good as I remembered, his dark eyes, that smile that seemed to make everything else around him fade into the background. "Hi," I greeted him, smiling as I walked over to the table where he was waiting. "Hey," he said, looking at me in a way that made my stomach flutter. "I was starting to think you might change your mind." I laughed nervously. "Not a chance." We sat down, and the conversation flowed easily, just like it always had. But this time, there was a new undercurrent to our words, a subtle tension that neither of us acknowledged but both could feel. There was something more between us now, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't just his youthful energy anymore, it was me too. I could feel myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't let myself in years. As we spoke, I noticed the way he looked at me, a softness in his gaze that made my pulse quicken. Was it just my imagination, or was there something more in his eyes? Was he thinking the same thing I was? I tried to shake the thought away, but it kept coming back. Was it wrong to be feeling this way? To be attracted to someone so much younger? I couldn't ignore it anymore. I realized with a shock that I was falling for him. The thought both excited and terrified me. How could this happen? Was it possible for someone like me, someone so much older, to feel this way? Would he even want someone like me? We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. Could this be real? Or was I just imagining something that wasn't there? That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced. I had never felt this way before. So unsure, so vulnerable. But at the same time, there was a part of me that didn't want to turn away from it. Did this feeling, this connection, really mean something? Could I allow myself to embrace it? Or was I just setting myself up for heartache? The days after our coffee meeting passed in a blur. My mind was consumed with thoughts of him. His smile, his laugh, the way his eyes seemed to focus on me with a warmth that made my heart ache. It was becoming harder to ignore the pull between us. Every time I saw him, my pulse quickened, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The age difference between us loomed large in my thoughts, a constant whisper of doubt. Why was I so drawn to him? What was it about his youthful energy that had stirred something inside of me that I thought had long since faded? I found myself second-guessing everything, my thoughts clouded by guilt and confusion. Was this wrong? Should I be feeling this way? He was so much younger, and I was at a stage in life where I thought those kinds of feelings were behind me. My experiences, my maturity, what could I possibly offer someone like him? I replayed our coffee conversation in my mind, looking for signs that he was feeling the same way. There had been that spark in his eyes, that lingering moment when our hands brushed against each other as he handed me my drink. Was that something? Or was I just imagining it? I couldn't deny that I was attracted to him, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. But then came the fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as something I wasn't, someone foolish, desperate, out of place. I questioned my own worth, wondering if I had lost my sense of who I was. Was this a fleeting infatuation, a midlife crisis of sorts, or was it something deeper? I couldn't decide, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. There were moments when I wanted to distance myself from him, to push him away before things could go too far. But then I'd remember the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was as though he was seeing me for who I really was, not just the version of me I had grown accustomed to, someone older, quieter, and fading into the background. But even as I longed to be with him, I struggled to let myself fully embrace it. What would people think? What if it all fell apart? What if this was just a fleeting thing? An illusion built on a moment of connection that didn't actually mean anything? As much as I wanted to dive into this feeling, I knew I had to be cautious. I couldn't just throw myself into it without thinking of the consequences. But could I really stay away from him, knowing what was stirring inside me? That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself asking 1,000 questions. Was this worth pursuing? Or was it too dangerous? Would I regret it if I walked away now? Or would I regret it even more if I didn't take the chance? The thought of inviting him to my home had been in my mind for days, swirling around like a tempting secret I wasn't sure I was ready to reveal. It seemed like the logical next step. If this connection was real, if there was something between us, we needed to see each other outside of the brief encounters at the store or over coffee. But the idea also filled me with a strange mix of excitement and fear. What if he didn't feel the same way when we were alone? What if he thought I was ridiculous? Or worse, desperate? Could I really allow myself to be that vulnerable? Could I open up to him in a way that felt too raw, too real? Still, the thought of spending more time with him, away from the prying eyes of the world, was too enticing to ignore. We had connected in a way that felt different, something more than just casual conversation. I wanted to know him better, to see where this could go. But I couldn't just call him up and ask him over. It had to be more than that, had to be carefully considered, even though my heart was already racing at the thought. Would he want to come? Or would he think it was too much too soon? Would he understand what I was offering? Or would I risk overstepping some invisible boundary that neither of us could articulate? I spent an entire evening debating with myself. I walked around my apartment, straightened things that didn't need straightening, hesitated before picking up my phone. Was I ready to take the step? Was I ready to invite him into my life in such an intimate way, where everything would be laid bare? Finally, I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed the message. Would you like to come over sometime? I thought it might be nice to spend more time together, just the two of us.
There?
It was done. My heart hammered in my chest as I hit send. Now, all I could do was wait. Did I make a mistake? Was I rushing into something I wasn't prepared for? Or was this the beginning of something real? Something meaningful? It didn't take long for him to reply. I'd like that. When works for you. I read his message several times, letting the words sink in. My heart soared, but at the same time, my doubts crept back in. What if this changed everything? What if he saw me in a way that wasn't what I hoped for? What if the evening ended in awkwardness and regret? But there was a part of me that pushed those fears aside, a part that told me this was the right thing to do. I had spent too many years in the safety of my comfort zone, avoiding anything that might challenge the quiet life I had built. This was different. I took a deep breath and replied, "How about tomorrow evening?" As I set my phone down, a rush of anticipation and nerves flooded my chest. Was this the start of something I had been too afraid to allow before? Or would it turn out to be a fleeting moment that left me wondering if I had made a mistake? As I prepared for his arrival, I couldn't shake the question. What would happen when he crossed the threshold of my home? Would I be ready to face whatever came next? When he arrived the next evening, I could hardly believe it. My apartment, usually quiet and empty, felt different with him in it. I had prepared everything. Made sure the lighting was soft, the music was soothing, the wine was ready. The evening was meant to be simple, just a chance for us to get to know each other better, away from the casual encounters at the store and coffee shop. But as soon as I opened the door and saw him standing there, I felt a rush of emotions flood over me. He smiled, that same warm, confident smile that had captivated me from the very beginning. His presence seemed to fill the room, and for a moment I couldn't find the words. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low but steady. It was a compliment that felt more meaningful than any I had received in years. The way he said it, the sincerity in his eyes, it made me feel like I was seeing myself through his eyes, not just the version of me that I saw in the mirror every day. "Thank you," I replied, a bit breathless. "Come in." As he stepped inside, I led him to the living room. We made small talk at first, just the usual pleasantries, but there was an undercurrent to our words now, an unspoken tension that I couldn't ignore. Every glance, every smile, felt loaded with more than just friendship. The evening unfolded slowly. We shared a bottle of wine, talked about our lives, our dreams, the things that made us who we were. But as the night wore on, the air between us seemed to change. There was a softness in his gaze, a quiet intimacy in the way he listened to me, and I felt myself drawn to him more than ever. As the conversation slowed, I found myself growing acutely aware of his presence. His nearness, the way he shifted in his seat, the way his hand occasionally brushed against mine. And then, in one of those moments where words became unnecessary, he reached out and gently touched my hand. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The touch was simple, innocent even, but it carried a weight that neither of us had addressed. I met his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't speak immediately, but there was something in the way he looked at me that told me he was waiting. Waiting for me to decide how this would unfold, how far I would let it go. Could I really allow this? Could I let myself feel something deeper, something that had been buried for so long? The doubts that had plagued me earlier still lingered, but they seemed quieter now, drowned out by the warmth between us. Without thinking, I leaned in slightly, closing the space between us. The moment was fragile, but it felt inevitable. "I've been wanting to do this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air for a moment, and I realized I had been wanting the same thing. Something shifted, something unspoken, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. It wasn't frantic or rushed, but gentle, deliberate. And it felt like everything I had been afraid to admit was suddenly there, present and real. I had spent so much time fighting the emotions that had been stirring within me, but in that kiss, I found a release, a sense of freedom I hadn't realized I had been craving. We pulled away after a long moment, both of us breathless, our eyes locked. Neither of us spoke, but there was no need. The question that had been in the air since our first encounter was finally answered. There was something here, something real. What came next, I wasn't sure. But in that moment, the connection between us was undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something other than loneliness, something that made me feel alive again. I couldn't help but ask myself, was this the beginning of something I had been too afraid to pursue before? Or was I about to let myself fall into a situation that would change everything? The days after that night were filled with a confusing mix of emotions. I had always considered myself someone who thought carefully, someone who followed the rules, who kept my life in order. But now, after everything that had happened between us, I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something that could change everything. It was impossible not to reflect on the age difference that had been so prominent in my mind in the beginning. I kept asking myself how I could have let it go so easily. Was this just a momentary lapse in judgment? Did I really have the right to pursue something with him? To indulge in feelings I had buried for so long? After all, what would people think? And more importantly, how would I explain it to myself? But then I remembered how it had felt when our hands brushed for the first time. The way his smile seemed to lift a weight off my chest. The way our conversations made me feel like I wasn't just the woman I had become. Someone defined by routines and responsibilities, but someone who was seen, really seen, in a way I hadn't been in years. There were moments when I would look at him and wonder if he saw me differently than I saw myself. Did he see the years I had accumulated? Did he see the lines on my face, the graying hair? Or was I just another person to him, someone to connect with, to learn from, to enjoy? The truth was I didn't know. But what I did know was this. The connection between us felt real. More real than I had ever allowed myself to believe. The age difference seemed insignificant when I was with him, and when I let myself stop overthinking, I realized how much of a gift this experience had been. It had reminded me that love, attraction, and desire aren't limited by age or time. They are feelings that emerge when we least expect them, when we open ourselves to the possibility of something more. I found myself thinking about the lessons I had learned so far, about not holding back, about embracing my desires, and about allowing myself to feel, to experience. Age had never been an issue when we were together. It was a concept that existed outside of the space we shared. Our connection wasn't defined by the years between us, but by the moments we created together. And in those moments, it didn't matter how old I was. What mattered was the truth we had found in each other. Love, I realized, was not something that adhered to societal expectations or norms. It didn't care about the labels we placed on ourselves. It existed in the spaces between words, in the shared silences, in the touches that spoke louder than anything we could say. The relationship we had, whatever it was, had taught me that. It had taught me to embrace who I was, to take chances, and to stop being afraid of what others might think. I had allowed myself to feel joy, excitement, and passion, things I thought I had long since lost touch with. And in doing so, I had found a part of myself I had forgotten existed. But still, the question lingered. What happens next? Would this last? Would it survive the realities of life, the judgment of others, and the obstacles we both might face as we walked this unfamiliar path together? Or would it burn out, like so many fleeting moments before it? I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that love, true love, wasn't something bound by time or expectations. It was something that could be lived, experienced, and cherished no matter when or how it happened. I asked myself, am I ready to see where this goes? To step fully into something that might just be the most unexpected, beautiful thing I've ever experienced. As I stood there, looking at him across the room, the uncertainty that had clouded my thoughts for so long began to fade. It wasn't just the warmth of his presence or the depth of his gaze that reassured me. It was the sense of peace I had found in myself. For so many years, I had clung to the idea that love had a specific shape, a specific timeline, one that didn't bend or shift based on circumstance. But now, I realized that love wasn't something to be understood. It was something to be felt. And that feeling, real, raw, and unfiltered, was exactly what I had been searching for all along. I had spent so much time worrying about the external pressures, the judgment that might come from others, the expectations I had placed on myself because of my age. But in the end, I couldn't ignore the truth of my feelings for him, how deeply I cared for him, how alive he made me feel, how much I wanted this connection to continue. There was no denying it now. He was a part of my life, a part of me, and whatever the future held, I knew I was ready to face it. Our relationship, as complicated as it might seem to the outside world, had shown me something profound, that love, in its truest form, knows no boundaries. Not age, not societal expectations, not any of the reasons we are often told to hold back. Love is simply love, in all its forms, and it thrives when we are brave enough to embrace it. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel self-conscious about the years between us. I didn't feel the weight of the world's judgments. I only felt the connection we had built, the understanding, the laughter, and the tenderness that had grown between us. This was real. This was more than just a momentary fling or a passing fancy. It was something that, in its quiet way, had reshaped me. I don't know what the future holds, I said softly, my voice full of sincerity. But I'm not afraid anymore. He smiled, that same smile that made me feel seen, heard, and understood. Neither am I, he said, stepping closer to me. And in that moment, I knew that no matter where life took us, I had already found something beautiful, a love that was not limited by time, but by the courage to embrace it, no matter what others might think. Because love, true love, was something that could bloom at any stage of life. It didn't care about age or time, or when it was supposed to happen. It simply existed, and all we had to do was allow ourselves to feel it. And with that thought, I knew we would be just fine no matter what came next. Because love was love, and that was all that mattered.